Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a world where your morning alarm is a rooster with anger management issues. Your breakfast could literally kill you, and your life expectancy is roughly the same as a modern smartphone battery. You're about to experience 24 hours as a medieval peasant, and spoiler alert, you probably won't make it to sunset without questioning every life choice that led you here. What's scarier than a horror movie? Waking up in 1347 and realizing this isn't a nightmare. It's Tuesday. Through the next few minutes, you'll discover why medieval peasants aged faster than milk in summer. And by the end of this journey, you'll understand why time travel to the Middle Ages should come with a hazard warning. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and what time you're listening. I love seeing where this story finds you around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first sensation that hits you isn't sight or sound, it's the smell. Your nostrils fill with a cocktail of unwashed bodies, rotting straw, and something that might charitably be called eau de barnyard. You're lying on what medieval people optimistically called a mattress, though it's really just a cloth sack stuffed with straw that's seen better centuries. The straw crackles beneath you like Rice Krispies, except these Rice Krispies have been marinating in human sweat for months. Your eyes flutter open to reveal a ceiling so low you could high-five it without stretching. The wooden beams above are black with soot and age, and you're pretty sure something just scurried across one of them. The single window, if you can call a hole in the wall with a piece of oiled cloth stretched across it, a window, lets in a dim, gray light that suggests dawn has arrived with all the enthusiasm of a tax collector. You try to stretch, but your body protests with aches in places you didn't know could ache. Medieval peasants didn't have chiropractors, and frankly, after sleeping on this medieval torture device masquerading as bedding, you understand why everyone in period paintings looks perpetually uncomfortable. The straw beneath you has compressed into something resembling concrete, and you're fairly certain you can feel every individual piece poking through the thin cloth. But wait, there's movement in the straw. Something small and determined is exploring the geography of your left foot. You jerk upright, and a mouse the size of a small hamster gives you an indignant look before disappearing into the bedding. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants developed their legendary stoicism through hardship, or simply because complaining about mice in your bed was like complaining about rain being wet. The air is thick enough to chew, a mixture of wood smoke, unwashed humanity, and the distinctive aroma of the chamber pot that sits in the corner like a ceramic monument to medieval plumbing technology. Your throat feels like you've been gargling sand, and there's a taste in your mouth that suggests your medieval ancestors had some interesting ideas about dental hygiene, namely, that it was optional. Around you, the single room that serves as bedroom, living room, kitchen, and occasionally barn, comes alive with the sounds of your medieval family stirring. Someone's coughing with the kind of wet, rattling sound that would send modern people straight to the emergency room. But here it's just Tuesday morning ambience. A baby starts crying somewhere in the straw-filled chaos, and you realize that privacy is a luxury that won't be invented for another few centuries. The floor beneath your feet is packed dirt, worn smooth by generations of medieval feet, and it's cold enough to make you question your life choices. There's no central heating, no electric blankets, no thermostats. Just you, the elements, and whatever warmth you can generate through the ancient art of shivering vigorously. Your clothes, which you slept in because medieval people didn't have the luxury of pajamas, feel like they've been marinated in a mixture of sweat, smoke, and regret. The fabric is rough enough to sand furniture, and you're pretty sure something is living in the seams. Medieval laundry day happened about as often as Halley's Comet, and with roughly the same level of celebration. As consciousness fully returns, you realize that the gnawing sensation in your stomach isn't just hunger. It's the kind of deep, aching emptiness that comes from a diet consisting mainly of hope and whatever didn't die over the winter. Your last meal was probably some combination of grain, water, and optimism, seasoned with the knowledge that today's breakfast might be yesterday's dinner reheated, if you're lucky. The reality of medieval peasant life hits you like a cart full of manure, which, incidentally, is probably what you'll be shoveling later today. There's no snooze button on medieval mornings, no coffee to ease the transition from unconsciousness to the harsh reality of subsistence living. Just you, your growling stomach, and the cheerful knowledge that today will be exactly like yesterday, which was exactly like the day before that, stretching back into a monotonous infinity of survival. Welcome to medieval peasant life, where every day is a masterclass in making the best of absolutely nothing, and your biggest achievement might be making it to tomorrow. Your stomach announces its presence with a growl that could wake the dead, which, given medieval mortality rates, is saying something. Time for breakfast, though calling it breakfast, is like calling a puddle an ocean. You shuffle toward the hearth, where the remains of last night's fire smolder with all the enthusiasm of a wet matchstick. The cooking pot hanging over the dying embers contains what medieval peasants optimistically called pottage, a gruel that's 1 part grain, 2 parts water, and 3 parts wishful thinking. It's been simmering since yesterday, which in medieval cooking terms means it's either perfectly aged or completely inedible. There's really no way to tell until you taste it, and by then it's too late. You stir the mixture with a wooden spoon that's seen more action than a medieval knight, and the consistency suggests someone mixed oatmeal with regret. The color is an unappetizing gray-brown that would make modern food photographers weep, and there are mysterious lumps floating in it that could be grain, vegetables, or small rocks. Medieval cooking was nothing if not adventurous. The first spoonful hits your tongue like a punishment for crimes you haven't committed yet. It tastes like someone boiled cardboard in dirty water and added a pinch of despair for seasoning. The texture is simultaneously gritty and slimy, achieving a culinary contradiction that would impress modern molecular gastronomists if they were into culinary masochism. Medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of complaining about their food, mainly because there often wasn't enough to complain about. This pottage represents the cornerstone of peasant nutrition, a beige monument to making something from nothing. Historians estimate that peasants consumed roughly 2,000 to 3,000 calories per day when food was available. But when food was available, was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. You chew thoughtfully on what might be a piece of barley or possibly a small pebble. Medieval grain processing wasn't exactly precision work. The local miller, who ground your grain into flour, had a reputation for being about as honest as a used cart salesman, and his millstones had a habit of contributing their own rocky seasoning to the final product. The pottage is accompanied by a chunk of bread that could double as a weapon in a pinch. Medieval peasant bread was made from whatever grain was available, which often meant a mixture of wheat, rye, barley, and sometimes oats, depending on what hadn't rotted in storage. The result was a dense, dark loaf that required serious jaw muscles to consume and could probably survive a direct hit from a catapult. You gnaw on the bread, with the determination of a beaver working on a particularly stubborn tree. The crust is hard enough to use as armor, and the inside has the texture of wet sand mixed with sawdust. There's a distinctly sour taste that suggests the bread is either fermented or going bad. In medieval times, these were often the same thing. Your breakfast beverage is small beer, because water was about as trustworthy as a politician's promise. Medieval people weren't stupid. They knew that drinking from the local stream was a fast track to an early grave, so they brewed weak beer that was safer than water and only slightly more alcoholic than modern energy drinks. It tastes like someone mixed bread crumbs with pond water and let it sit in the sun for a week. The small beer has an alcohol content of about 2 to 3%, just enough to kill most bacteria, but not enough to make you forget you're eating gruel for breakfast. It's warm, flat, and has a yeasty flavor that grows on you, mainly because you don't have any other choice. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually enjoyed small beer or just drank it because the alternative was dysentery. But either way, you're drinking it now. As you force down your medieval breakfast, you notice your family members doing the same with the resigned efficiency of people who have accepted that food is fuel, not pleasure. Children as young as 5 are gnawing on the rock-hard bread with the determination of tiny medieval warriors, their jaws working overtime to extract whatever nutrition they can from this culinary challenge. The pottage pot will be refilled throughout the day with whatever vegetables, herbs, or protein sources become available. And by protein sources, we mean anything that doesn't run away fast enough. Medieval peasants were the original nose-to-tail eaters, not by choice but by necessity. Nothing edible was wasted, and the definition of edible was considerably more flexible than modern standards would allow. Your stomach, still growling despite the pottage, reminds you that this breakfast is probably the most substantial meal you'll have today. Medieval peasants typically ate 2 meals, breakfast and dinner, with dinner being the main event sometime in the late morning or early afternoon. Supper, if it happened at all, was usually just leftover pottage or bread. The irony isn't lost on you that in an age where most people worked in food production, most people were also chronically hungry. Medieval agriculture was a constant battle against weather, pests, disease, and the basic physics of trying to feed a family on a plot of land smaller than a modern suburban lawn. As you scrape the bottom of your bowl, extracting every last grain of pottage, you realize that medieval peasants had elevated the art of making nothing into something to a level that would impress modern minimalists. Time to get dressed, though dressed in medieval peasant terms is more like wrapped in whatever fabric hasn't completely disintegrated yet. You reach for your clothes, which are conveniently located right next to you because medieval peasants didn't have walk-in closets. They had walk-around the pile of clothes corners. Your undergarment, if you're lucky enough to have one, is a linen shift that's seen more action than a medieval battlefield. It's the color of old parchment mixed with questionable stains, and it feels like wearing a burlap sack that someone forgot to soften. Medieval linen was tough enough to stop arrows, which was handy, considering how often peasants found themselves in arrow-stopping situations. The shift clings to your skin with the enthusiasm of a medieval tax collector, scratchy and persistent. Medieval people didn't have the luxury of cotton, which wouldn't become widely available in Europe for several more centuries. Instead, they made do with linen made from flax, wool from sheep, and occasionally hemp for the really rough garments that doubled as medieval sandpaper. Over the shift goes your tunic, a loose-fitting garment that's part shirt, part tent, and part fashion disaster. It's made from wool that still remembers being on a sheep, complete with the authentic barnyard aroma that no amount of medieval washing could eliminate. The color is what medieval people called natural, which is a polite way of saying the color of dirt mixed with sheep. The tunic reaches down to about your knees, providing coverage and modesty, while also ensuring that you look like you're wearing a potato sack with aspirations. Medieval fashion wasn't about looking good. It was about staying warm, staying covered, and staying alive, preferably in that order. The sleeves are long enough to cover your arms but short enough to keep you from accidentally setting yourself on fire while tending the hearth. Your hose, medieval leggings that would make modern yoga pants weep with envy, are made from wool and held up by a complex system of ties and prayers. They're designed to cover your legs from foot to hip, assuming they don't fall down, tear, or spontaneously combust from the friction of walking. Medieval hose were the original compression garments, mainly because they compressed your circulation until your feet went numb. The hose attached to your braise, medieval underwear that's essentially a linen loincloth with delusions of grandeur. Getting into braise requires the flexibility of a medieval acrobat and the patience of a saint. Because the ties have to be adjusted just right, or you'll spend the day constantly hitching up your medieval undergarments like a peasant with a wedgie. Your shoes, if you're fortunate enough to own them, are leather constructions that were probably made by someone who had heard of feet but never actually seen them. Medieval shoemaking was more art than science, and the art in question was abstract expressionism. The leather is thick enough to stop small projectiles, but flexible enough to allow your feet to bend in directions feet weren't meant to bend. The shoes have no left or right. They're ambidextrous footwear that will eventually conform to your feet through a process medieval people called breaking in, and modern people would call torture. There are no laces, just leather ties that require the engineering skills of a medieval architect to secure properly. Walking in medieval shoes is like walking in leather bags filled with good intentions and questionable craftsmanship. If you don't have shoes, and many peasants didn't, you're going barefoot, which in medieval times meant your feet would develop calluses thick enough to use as spare leather. Medieval feet were basically organic shoes, toughened by years of walking on surfaces that would challenge modern hiking boots. Your outer garment is a cloak or mantle, depending on the season and your social status. It's made from wool that's been woven with the care and attention of someone who knew this might be the only warm thing you own for the next decade. The cloak is held together by a brooch or pin that's probably worth more than everything else you own combined, because medieval people understood that staying warm was more important than looking fashionable. The entire ensemble is held together by a belt made from leather that's seen more years than most medieval peasants. The belt serves multiple purposes. It holds up your clothes, carries your few possessions, and provides something to hang yourself with if the medieval lifestyle becomes too overwhelming. Medieval belts were the original utility belts, designed to carry knives, pouches, and whatever else you needed to survive another day. Getting dressed in medieval clothing is like solving a puzzle designed by someone who hated comfort. Everything ties, wraps, or pins in place, and if you get the order wrong, you'll spend the day looking like you were dressed by a drunk tailor in the dark. Medieval people developed the patience of saints mainly because getting dressed required the organizational skills of a medieval quartermaster. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually liked their clothing, or just wore it because nakedness was frowned upon by the church. But either way, you're now dressed in the height of medieval peasant fashion. You look like a walking advertisement for the concept of making do, and you smell like a sheep that's been rolling in a herb garden. The final touch is your head covering, a simple cap or coif that keeps your hair out of your face and provides the illusion of cleanliness. Medieval, the sound that makes your medieval blood run cold isn't a wolf howl or a war horn. It's the manor bell, clanging with the authority of someone who owns your entire existence. That's your lord's wake-up call, and it means one thing: time to work for free on someone else's land while your own crops wither from neglect. Welcome to the feudal system, where fair is just something that happens to weather. You grab your tools, a collection of wooden and iron implements that look like they were designed by someone who had heard of farming but never actually tried it, and trudge toward the Lord's domain. The domain is the fancy medieval term for the good land that you work but don't own, as opposed to your own strip of land, which is the terrible land that you own but can't work because you're always working the good land. Your lord, who's probably still in bed enjoying what medieval people called the luxury of not being a peasant, has graciously decided that today you'll be plowing his fields. This involves following behind an ox that's having an existential crisis, guiding a plow that seems determined to go everywhere except where you want it to go, and pretending that this is a reasonable way to spend your finite time on Earth. The ox, let's call him Gerald, has the intelligence of a medieval philosopher and the cooperation level of a toddler having a meltdown. Gerald stops when you want him to go, goes when you want him to stop, and has developed the annoying habit of relieving himself precisely when you're walking behind him. Medieval farming was basically an elaborate dance between humans and animals, and the animals were leading. Your plow is a technological marvel by medieval standards, which is to say it's a piece of wood with some iron bits attached that occasionally breaks the soil instead of just dragging across it like a very expensive stick. The moldboard plow, introduced sometime in the early medieval period, was supposed to revolutionize agriculture, but Gerald didn't get the memo about revolution. As you wrestle with Gerald and the plow, you're joined by other peasants who look exactly as thrilled as you feel about spending their day making their lord richer, while their own families subsist on hope and pottage. There's Willem, who's been plowing for 40 years and has developed the philosophical outlook of someone who's accepted that life is basically one long, muddy furrow. There's Agnes, who can curse in 3 languages and make Gerald move with a combination of threats and what might be actual witchcraft. The work is backbreaking in the most literal sense. Medieval peasants developed spinal problems that would make modern chiropractors rich, if modern chiropractors existed and accepted payment in turnips. You bend, lift, push, and pull until your muscles scream protests in languages that haven't been invented yet. Your hands, already rough from a lifetime of manual labor, develop new calluses on top of old calluses, creating a topographical map of medieval suffering. Historians still argue whether the feudal system was a form of protection or exploitation, but from your current position behind Gerald's digestive system, it feels distinctly like the latter. You owe your lord labor service, typically 2 or 3 days per week, in exchange for the right to farm your own small plot and the theoretical protection of his castle, which is about as useful as a chocolate teapot when bandits come calling. The sun climbs higher, and you realize that medieval people didn't have lunch breaks, water coolers, or workers' compensation. You get a brief rest when Gerald decides to stage a sit-down strike, but otherwise, it's continuous labor from dawn until the Lord's overseer decides you've suffered enough for one day. The overseer, a man who's elevated being unpleasant to an art form, watches you work with the intensity of someone who gets paid to find fault with everything. Your lord's fields stretch out like a green carpet of someone else's prosperity, and you can't help but notice how much better the soil is here compared to your own rocky patch of agricultural optimism. Medieval lords had a talent for claiming the best land, and leaving their peasants with whatever was left over after God finished making the good parts of the countryside. The irony of medieval agriculture is that the people who produced the food were the ones least likely to have enough of it. You're growing grain that will fill your lord's granary, while your own family counts every kernel like precious gems. Medieval peasants were the original gig economy workers, except the gig never ended and the economy was based on not dying. As the day wears on, you develop a deep appreciation for why medieval peasants aged faster than milk in summer. Every muscle in your body has filed a formal complaint. Your back feels like it's been used as a medieval siege weapon, and you're pretty sure Gerald has developed a personal vendetta against you specifically. The feudal obligations don't end with plowing. There's also harvesting, thrashing, hauling, building, and whatever other tasks your lord's imagination can conjure. The village well is the medieval equivalent of social media. Everyone gathers here to share information, spread rumors, and judge each other's life choices. You approach with your wooden bucket, joining the queue of peasants who look like they've been marinated in gossip and left to ferment in the sun. The well itself is a stone circle that's seen more secrets than a medieval confessor, surrounded by mud that's been churned into a consistency somewhere between pudding and quicksand by generations of peasant feet. The rope and bucket system requires the engineering skills of a medieval architect and the patience of a saint, because medieval wells were designed by people who apparently enjoyed making simple tasks unnecessarily complicated. As you wait your turn, you catch fragments of conversation that paint a picture of village life more colorful than a medieval illuminated manuscript. Goodwife Martha is explaining to anyone who will listen why her neighbor's chickens are laying fewer eggs. Clearly it's because someone gave her the evil eye during last week's market day. Medieval people had a theory for everything, and that theory usually involved supernatural intervention or someone's moral failings. Mark my words, Martha whispers with the authority of someone who's never been wrong about anything. It's that new woman from the next village. She looked at my hens funny, and now they're acting like they've forgotten how to be chickens. Medieval logic was beautifully simple. If something went wrong, someone was to blame, and that someone was usually whoever was most recently different or unfortunate. The conversation shifts to the miller's wife, who's apparently been seen talking to herself near the forest edge. In medieval times, talking to yourself was either a sign of madness or witchcraft, depending on whether people liked you or not. The miller's wife, unfortunately, had the double disadvantage of being both unpopular and married to a man who consistently shortchanged people on their grain measurements. Young Thomas, whose voice is still cracking like a medieval whip, pipes up with news that the Lord's son has been spotted riding through the village with a group of armed men. This causes a ripple of concern among the gathered peasants, because armed nobles riding through peasant villages rarely brought good news. Medieval nobles had a habit of treating peasant villages like their personal entertainment centers, and the entertainment usually involved taking things that didn't belong to them. The water you're drawing up is the color of weak tea and has a taste that suggests it's been filtered through several layers of medieval optimism. Medieval wells were basically community petri dishes, collecting runoff from the surrounding area along with whatever the local livestock decided to contribute. You drink it anyway because the alternative is dying of thirst, and medieval people were practical about their mortality risks. Goodman Robert, whose face looks like it's been carved from a particularly pessimistic piece of wood, shares the latest news from the next village over. Apparently, 3 families have come down with the sweating sickness, and the local priest has been called in to perform last rites more often than Sunday Mass. Medieval diseases spread faster than gossip, and gossip spread faster than wildfire. So this news has everyone calculating their chances of survival. The conversation turns to the upcoming harvest, and the mood grows darker than a medieval winter. The spring rains were either too much or too little. Medieval weather was never just right, and everyone's crops are looking about as healthy as a medieval peasant's retirement plan. Crop failure meant famine, and famine meant that the village population would be significantly smaller by next spring. Agnes the Wise, who's earned her nickname through a combination of longevity and the ability to predict disaster with uncanny accuracy, shares her observation that the crows have been acting strange. Medieval people paid attention to animal behavior the way modern people check weather apps, and Agnes's crow-based meteorology has a better track record than most medieval predictions. They're gathering in numbers I haven't seen since the year of the Great Hunger, Agnes intones with the gravity of someone delivering a prophecy. Mark my words, we're in for a hard winter. Medieval people had long memories for disasters, and they passed down knowledge of bad omens like family heirlooms. The discussion shifts to more practical matters. Who's been stealing vegetables from whose garden, whether the baker's weights are honest, and why the blacksmith's prices have gone up again. Medieval village economics were based on a complex system of mutual suspicion and grudging cooperation, seasoned with enough petty grievances to fuel a small war. Historians still argue whether medieval villages were close-knit communities or collections of people who happened to live near each other while plotting each other's downfall. But the truth was probably somewhere in between. Medieval peasants depended on each other for survival, but they also competed for the same limited resources, creating a social dynamic that was part cooperation, part competition, and part soap opera. As you fill your bucket and prepare to leave, you realize that the village well serves as more than just a water source. It's the medieval internet, where information flows as freely as the questionable water, and everyone's business becomes everyone else's, and the cough that echoes from the next hut over isn't just any cough. It's the wet, rattling sound that makes medieval hearts skip a beat and medieval minds race to the darkest possibilities. In a world where medical knowledge consists of pray harder and maybe try bleeding yourself, that cough might as well be a death sentence with a very short deadline. You pause in your morning routine, listening to the sound that's become as familiar as church bells in medieval villages. It's the kind of cough that starts with one person and spreads through a community faster than gossip about the miller's dishonest scales. Medieval diseases didn't need social media to go viral. They had cramped living conditions, poor sanitation, and the medieval understanding of hygiene, which was basically dirt builds character. The sweating sickness has been making rounds through the neighboring villages like a particularly unwelcome traveling merchant, leaving behind empty houses and grieving families. Medieval people had names for all the ways death could visit: the bloody flux, the king's evil, the falling sickness. And they spoke of these ailments with the familiarity of people who lived on intimate terms with mortality. Your neighbor Goodman Edmund emerges from his hut looking like Death's apprentice, his face the color of old parchment and his eyes sunken deep enough to hide small animals. Medieval people aged quickly under the best circumstances, but illness could transform a healthy peasant into a walking skeleton in a matter of days. Edmund's wife follows behind him, wringing her hands with the practiced desperation of someone who's watched too many neighbors disappear into the ground. The village response to illness follows a pattern as predictable as the seasons. First comes the whispered speculation. Is it something he ate, something he touched, or something supernatural? Medieval people understood that diseases spread, but their theories about how ranged from bad air to divine punishment to that woman from the next village who definitely practices witchcraft. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually believed in the medical treatments they used, or just hoped for the best while trying everything available. But when you're facing death with nothing but medieval medicine, optimism becomes a survival strategy. The local wise woman, who serves as the village's medical expert despite having no formal training beyond, "I've seen this before and the person died," arrives with her collection of herbs, prayers, and questionable remedies. Medieval medicine was a fascinating combination of ancient wisdom, religious faith, and complete guesswork. The wise woman examines Edmund's urine, because medieval doctors believed you could diagnose everything from lovesickness to demonic possession by looking at someone's pee, and pronounces that his humors are unbalanced. This is medieval medical speak for something's wrong, but we have no idea what. The treatment begins with bloodletting, because medieval medical theory held that most illnesses were caused by having too much blood, which seems counterintuitive when dealing with someone who already looks like a walking corpse. The wise woman produces a collection of leeches that look like they've been dining well on previous patients, and Edmund submits to the treatment with the resignation of someone who knows this might be his last chance. While the leeches do their work, the wise woman prepares a potion that contains ingredients ranging from the practical willow bark, which actually does contain a compound similar to aspirin, to the bizarre powdered unicorn horn, which was usually narwhal tusk, and about as medically useful as you'd expect. Medieval pharmacology was like playing medical roulette with ingredients that might help, might do nothing, or might finish the job the disease started. The village priest arrives to provide spiritual medicine, because medieval people understood that if the body was failing, the soul needed attention too. He carries holy water, sacred relics, and the kind of grim expression that suggests he's already mentally composing Edmund's funeral sermon. Medieval priests doubled as counselors, medical advisors, and grief specialists, making them the original healthcare workers. As Edmund's condition worsens, the whispers grow louder. Someone mentions that he was seen talking to a stranger from another village last week. Someone else remembers that his chickens stopped laying eggs around the same time. Medieval people had a talent for finding patterns in random events, and when someone was dying, every coincidence became a potential explanation. The fear is palpable, not just fear of death, but fear of what comes after. Medieval people lived with the constant awareness that death could arrive without warning, and the afterlife was no guaranteed improvement. The church taught that dying with unconfessed sins meant eternal damnation, which added spiritual terror to physical suffering. By evening, Edmund's breathing has become labored, and his family gathers around his bedside for what medieval people called the watching, the vigil that preceded death. Medieval people didn't die alone if they could help it, because dying without witnesses meant no one could report your final words or ensure your soul received proper prayers. The village settles into an uneasy night, everyone listening for sounds from Edmund's hut and calculating their own chances of survival. Medieval communities were small enough that every death diminished the collective strength, and diseases had a way of taking the people you could least afford to lose. The church bell tolls with the authority of divine command, and you know that resistance is futile. God apparently has strong opinions about your Sunday attendance, and the local priest has even stronger opinions about what happens to peasants who skip Mass. You trudge toward the stone building that dominates your village like a medieval skyscraper, wondering if salvation is worth the loss of your only day off. The church looms before you, its stone walls blackened with age and soot, looking like it was built by people who wanted to remind everyone that God was watching, and he wasn't particularly amused. Medieval churches were designed to inspire awe and terror in equal measure, and they succeeded spectacularly. The building could house your entire village with room left over for a small army, which was probably the point. Medieval people understood the power of architectural intimidation. You file in with the rest of the village, a procession of unwashed humanity dressed in their least dirty clothes. Medieval people had church clothes and work clothes, and the distinction was mainly whether the stains were fresh or aged to perfection. The air inside is thick with incense, body odor, and the kind of religious fervor that comes from people who genuinely believe their eternal souls are at stake. The priest, Father Benedict, stands at the altar like a medieval motivational speaker, except his motivation involves eternal damnation and the very real possibility that you're all going to hell for thinking impure thoughts about your neighbor's wife. Medieval priests had job security that modern workers could only dream of. Everyone needed salvation, and the church had a monopoly on the salvation business. Father Benedict begins the service in Latin, which approximately 0% of the congregation understands, but medieval people had learned to look appropriately reverent while mentally planning their day. The Latin flows over you like a river of incomprehensible syllables, and you nod along with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who's perfected the art of looking spiritually engaged, while thinking about whether your turnips need watering. The sermon, delivered in the local language, so everyone can understand exactly how doomed they are, focuses on the dangers of pride, greed, and the 7 deadly sins that medieval people committed with the regularity of breathing. Father Benedict has a talent for making ordinary human behavior sound like a direct insult to the Almighty, and he delivers his message with the passion of someone who genuinely believes his congregation is one missed mass away from eternal torment. Medieval Christianity wasn't the gentle, forgiving religion of modern times. It was fire and brimstone with a side order of guilt and a generous helping of fear. The church taught that life was a test, death was inevitable, and the afterlife was a cosmic sorting system where most people ended up in the eternal suffering category. This made for highly motivated congregations and very nervous peasants. You glance around at your fellow worshippers, noting the familiar faces wearing expressions of pious concentration mixed with barely concealed terror. Goodwife Agnes clutches her wooden cross like a medieval security blanket, while young Thomas tries to look holy, while obviously fighting the urge to scratch what appears to be a flea infestation of biblical proportions. The collection plate makes its rounds, and you contribute your required tithe, 10% of everything you produce, because apparently God has expensive tastes and the church has bills to pay. Medieval tithing wasn't optional. It was a religious obligation backed by the threat of excommunication, which was the medieval equivalent of being unfriended by God himself. Father Benedict launches into a detailed description of hell that would make modern horror writers take notes. Medieval hell wasn't just hot. It was a carefully organized torture facility with specialized punishments for specific sins. Thieves had their hands cut off repeatedly, liars had their tongues torn out, and people who worked on Sundays were forced to carry burning stones for eternity. The medieval imagination, when it came to eternal punishment, was remarkably creative. The service includes prayers for the sick, the dead, and the harvest, because medieval people understood that divine intervention was their best hope for survival in a world that seemed designed to kill them. You pray for Edmund, who's still clinging to life despite the best efforts of medieval medicine, and for your own crops, which are currently engaged in a losing battle with drought, pests, and what might be divine displeasure. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely believed in the literal truth of every church teaching, or simply went along with it, because the alternative was social ostracism and possible damnation. But either way, the church dominated medieval life with an authority that modern institutions can only envy. The priest wasn't just a spiritual leader. He was teacher, judge, counselor, and the person who decided whether you spent eternity in paradise or perpetual agony. The service concludes with a blessing that's supposed to protect you from evil spirits, bad weather, and the various supernatural threats that medieval people believed lurked around every corner. Medieval Christianity was practical religion. It offered protection from demons, guidance for daily decisions, and the promise that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next, assuming you followed the rules and paid your tithes. As you file out of the church, you notice the carved stone gargoyles leering down at you with expressions that suggest they know something you don't. Medieval churches were decorated with enough frightening imagery to give children nightmares and adults second thoughts about skipping confession. The message was clear. God was watching, judgment was coming, and your best bet was to stay on the church's good side. The rest of Sunday stretches before you, a day of rest that's really just a different kind of work, because animals still need feeding, fires still need tending, and medieval life doesn't pause for religious observance. You'll spend the afternoon in quiet. Your farming tools look like they were designed by someone who had heard of agriculture, but never actually tried it. And using them feels like trying to perform surgery with kitchen utensils. You heft your wooden plow, which weighs roughly the same as a small ox, and has about the same level of cooperation, wondering how medieval people managed to feed anyone with equipment that seems better suited for medieval torture than medieval farming. The plow itself is a masterpiece of medieval engineering, which is to say it's a piece of wood with some iron bits attached that occasionally breaks the soil instead of just dragging across it like an expensive stick. Medieval plows came in two varieties. The light plow, which worked well on soft soil and was about as useful as a chocolate teapot on heavy clay, and the heavy plow, which could break tough ground but required a team of oxen and the engineering skills of a medieval architect to operate. Your sickle, the curved blade you'll use for harvesting, looks like it was forged by a blacksmith who was having a bad day and decided to take it out on innocent iron. The blade is sharp enough to cut grain and dull enough to require the kind of repetitive motion that would give modern ergonomics experts nightmares. Medieval harvesters could cut about an acre of wheat in a day, but they had to make approximately 15,000 individual cuts to do it, which explains why most medieval peasants had arthritis by their mid-30s. The scythe, used for cutting hay and grass, is basically a sickle's bigger, more dangerous cousin. It consists of a long wooden handle attached to a curved blade that's designed to cut through vegetation with smooth, sweeping motions, assuming you have the coordination of a medieval dancer and the upper body strength of someone who's been swinging farming tools since childhood. One wrong move with a scythe, and you'll discover why medieval people had such a healthy respect for sharp objects. Your hoe, which looks like someone attached a flat piece of iron to a stick and called it agricultural innovation, is designed for breaking up soil, removing weeds, and providing a workout that would challenge modern fitness enthusiasts. Medieval hoeing was like doing repetitive squats while holding a weight, except the squats lasted all day, and the weight was trying to catch on every rock and root in the field. The wooden rake, used for gathering hay and smoothing soil, represents the pinnacle of medieval simplicity. It's literally just a stick with other sticks attached to it. But don't let its simplicity fool you. Medieval rakes were precision instruments that required the right spacing between tines, the correct angle of attachment, and wood that could withstand the kind of abuse that comes from daily use by people who couldn't afford to replace their tools every season. Your spade, carved from a single piece of wood with an iron edge if you're lucky, is designed for digging and moving soil with the efficiency of someone trying to empty a lake with a teaspoon. Medieval spades were smaller and lighter than modern versions, partly because iron was expensive, and partly because medieval people had learned to work with tools that required technique rather than brute force. The flail, used for thrashing grain, consists of two wooden sticks connected by leather or rope, and using it feels like trying to conduct an orchestra while the instruments are actively trying to escape. Medieval thrashing was the art of beating grain stalks to separate the kernels from the straw, and it required rhythm, timing, and the ability to avoid knocking yourself unconscious with your own farming implement. Your cart, if you're fortunate enough to own one, is a wooden construction that creaks and groans like it's in constant pain. Medieval carts were built for durability rather than comfort, with wooden wheels that provided all the shock absorption of riding on solid stone. The cart serves multiple purposes: hauling crops, transporting manure, and occasionally carrying family members who are too sick or too old to walk. Historians still argue whether medieval farming tools were ingeniously simple or simply inadequate, but either way, you're stuck with equipment that requires skill, strength, and the kind of patience that comes from knowing these tools might have to last your entire lifetime. Medieval peasants couldn't just run to the hardware store when something broke. They had to repair, modify, and maintain their tools with whatever materials were available. The maintenance of your tools is a constant concern that occupies winter evenings and rainy days. Wooden handles crack and need replacement. Iron edges dull and require sharpening, and leather bindings rot and must be renewed. Medieval tool maintenance was like playing a constant game of mechanical whack-a-mole, where fixing one problem often revealed two more. Your tools also serve as a form of medieval currency and inheritance. A good plow or a sharp scythe could be worth more than a year's worth of grain, and tools were often passed down through generations like family heirlooms. Medieval wills frequently included detailed inventories of farming implements, because a family's survival often depended on having the right tools for the right jobs. The irony of medieval agriculture is that the people who fed society had the worst equipment for doing so. While lords and nobles invested in weapons and luxury goods, peasants made do with tools that were functional but far from optimal. Yet somehow, using these primitive implements, medieval peasants managed to feed not only themselves, but also the entire feudal hierarchy that depended on their labor. Working with medieval tools teaches you to appreciate the relationship between human skill and mechanical advantage. Modern farming relies on machines that do most of the work. Medieval farming relied on people who had learned to make simple tools do complex jobs through technique, timing, and the kind of physical conditioning that comes from a lifetime of manual labor. Market day transforms your sleepy village into a medieval circus, where everyone's trying to sell something they probably shouldn't have and buy things they definitely can't afford. You clutch your small collection of eggs, cheese, and whatever vegetables survived your garden's ongoing battle with nature, ready to enter the chaotic world of medieval commerce where buyer beware isn't just advice, it's a survival strategy. The market square buzzes with activity that would make a modern shopping mall look peaceful. Merchants have set up wooden stalls that lean at angles that defy both physics and common sense, displaying goods that range from the essential to the questionable to the "why would anyone want that?" Medieval markets were democracy in action. Anyone could set up shop, and anyone could lose their life savings to a smooth-talking trader with a cart full of authentic relics. You navigate through the crowd, which consists of peasants like yourself mixed with traveling merchants who look like they've seen every scam in the medieval playbook and invented a few new ones. The noise is incredible. People shouting prices, animals making their displeasure known, and the constant sound of wooden wheels on cobblestones that creates a percussion section for this medieval symphony of commerce. The baker's stall offers bread that looks suspiciously similar to the rocks in your field, while the baker himself weighs each loaf with scales that appear to have been calibrated by someone with a very loose relationship with mathematics. Medieval bakers had a reputation for creative accounting that would make modern tax advisors jealous, and their bread prices fluctuated based on factors ranging from grain availability to the baker's mood to whether he liked your face. At the cloth merchant's stall, you examine fabric that feels like it was woven from the dreams of very uncomfortable sheep. Medieval textiles came in two varieties, scratchy and scratchier, with colors that ranged from mud brown to slightly different mud brown. The merchant assures you that the fabric is the finest quality, which in medieval terms means it probably won't disintegrate the first time you wash it. The livestock section of the market resembles a medieval zoo where all the animals have attitude problems. Chickens squawk with the indignation of creatures who know they're destined for someone's dinner pot, while pigs root through the market debris with the enthusiasm of medieval garbage disposals. A cow moos mournfully, probably contemplating the philosophical implications of being sold by the pound. You approach the grain merchant, whose scales look like they were designed by someone who thought accuracy was optional. Medieval grain trading was an art form that required the negotiating skills of a diplomat and the suspicious nature of a detective, because grain merchants had elevated creative measuring to a professional skill. The merchant smiles with the warmth of someone calculating how much he can overcharge you without causing a riot. Haggling begins immediately, because medieval markets operated on the principle that the first price mentioned was merely a starting point for negotiations. You offer half of what the merchant asks. He acts mortally offended. You increase your offer slightly, and he responds as if you've personally insulted his ancestors. This dance continues until you reach a price that leaves both parties feeling slightly cheated, which in medieval commerce was considered a successful transaction. The cheese vendor displays wheels of cheese that look like they've been aging since the last crusade, with flavors that range from aggressively sharp to probably a biological weapon. Medieval cheese was preserved through techniques that involved salt, time, and hoping for the best, resulting in products that could survive longer than most medieval peasants and had roughly the same texture as leather. A traveling merchant catches your attention with promises of exotic spices from distant lands. His collection includes what he claims is black pepper from the Orient, cinnamon from mysterious islands, and salt that's supposedly blessed by foreign priests. Medieval spice trading was like medieval fantasy football. Lots of speculation, occasional big wins, and frequent disappointment when you discovered your exotic spices were actually local herbs with creative marketing. The blacksmith stall displays tools and implements that look like they were forged in the fires of medieval ambition and tempered with the tears of peasants who couldn't afford them. Medieval metalwork was expensive enough to make modern luxury goods look affordable, and a good knife or farming tool could cost more than a family's food budget for a month. Historians still argue whether medieval markets were efficient economic systems or elaborate schemes to separate peasants from their money. But either way, you're participating in commerce that operates on principles of mutual suspicion and creative interpretation of weights and measures. Medieval market regulations existed mainly as suggestions, and enforcement was about as reliable as medieval weather prediction. The fish vendor offers catches that smell like they've been traveling longer than most medieval pilgrims, while insisting they were caught, just this morning, in waters that may or may not exist. Medieval fish preservation involved salt, smoke, and optimism, resulting in products that could survive long journeys but might not survive close inspection. As the day progresses, you realize that medieval markets were social events as much as economic ones. People came not just to buy and sell, but to exchange gossip, arrange marriages, settle disputes, and participate in the kind of community interaction that modern people get from social media, except with more livestock and less reliable information. Your transactions complete, you head home with slightly less money and slightly more goods than you started with, having participated in an economic system that somehow managed to keep medieval society functioning despite operating on principles that would make modern economists weep. Medieval markets were proof that commerce could thrive even when nobody trusted anybody, and everyone was trying to cheat everyone else. Darkness falls over your medieval village like a heavy blanket woven from fear, superstition, and the very real possibility that something with teeth is lurking just beyond the circle of firelight. Medieval nights weren't just dark, they were aggressively, oppressively, supernaturally dark, the kind of darkness that made modern people understand why their ancestors invented so many creative ways to be terrified of the night. You huddle closer to the hearth, where the fire crackles with the determination of humanity's last stand against the encroaching void. Medieval fires weren't just sources of light and warmth. They were barriers against the supernatural forces that everyone knew became more active after sunset. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls that looked suspiciously like the demons, and spirits that medieval people were absolutely certain were waiting for their chance to cause mischief. Outside, the wind howls through the village with a sound that could be weather or could be the souls of the damned, depending on your theological perspective and how much small beer you've consumed. Medieval people had excellent imaginations when it came to interpreting nighttime sounds, and every creak, groan, or unexplained noise was potential evidence of supernatural activity. Your family gathers around the fire like medieval survivors of an apocalypse that happens every night at sunset. Medieval people understood that darkness brought dangers both natural and supernatural, and the smart response was to stick together, stay near the fire, and avoid doing anything that might attract unwanted attention from whatever was prowling around outside. The stories begin because medieval people had perfected the art of scaring themselves senseless with tales designed to make sleep impossible. Tonight's entertainment features the ghost of old Henrik, who supposedly walks the village paths looking for his lost sheep, and the witch who lives in the forest and steals children who don't say their prayers properly. Medieval ghost stories weren't entertainment. They were educational tools designed to teach proper behavior through the application of pure terror. Goodwife Martha contributes a tale about the black dog that appears before someone dies, while young Thomas adds details about the mysterious lights that dance in the cemetery on moonless nights. Medieval folklore was a collaborative effort where everyone contributed their own terrifying experiences and embellishments, creating a shared mythology that made nighttime a community horror experience. The conversation turns to more practical fears: wolves, which were very real and very hungry, especially during harsh winters when their usual prey became scarce. Medieval wolves weren't the misunderstood creatures of modern wildlife documentaries. They were efficient predators that viewed isolated humans as convenient snacks. Village records from the period document wolf attacks with the matter-of-fact tone of people reporting weather conditions. Bandits represent another genuine nighttime threat, because medieval law enforcement was about as effective as medieval dentistry. Desperate men with weapons and no moral constraints roamed the countryside looking for easy targets, and isolated peasant families represented the medieval equivalent of unlocked cars in bad neighborhoods. Medieval people slept with weapons within reach not because they were paranoid, but because they were realistic. The fire begins to die down, and someone needs to venture outside to gather more wood, a task that requires the courage of a medieval knight and the speed of someone being chased by demons. Medieval people had developed elaborate rituals for nighttime excursions, including prayers, protective charms, and the buddy system, because going outside alone after dark was considered only slightly less dangerous than juggling flaming swords. Your children listen to the adult conversations with the wide-eyed attention of people learning important survival information. Medieval children grew up understanding that the world was full of dangers both visible and invisible, and nighttime was when those dangers became most active. They learned to sleep lightly, stay close to family, and never, ever go outside alone after sunset. The church bell tolls the hour, its bronze voice cutting through the darkness like a medieval security system. Medieval church bells served multiple purposes. They marked time, called people to prayer, and reminded everyone that God was watching even when human eyes couldn't see. The sound was reassuring to the faithful and terrifying to anything supernatural that might be considering mischief. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely believed in all the supernatural threats they feared, or simply used ghost stories as a way to enforce social control and explain unexplained phenomena. But either way, medieval nights were times of genuine anxiety and careful behavior. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a presence that brought its own rules and dangers. As the evening progresses, you realize that medieval people had developed sophisticated strategies for surviving the night. They traveled in groups, carried protective charms, knew which paths to avoid, and understood the importance of being inside, behind locked doors, before full darkness fell. Medieval night survival was a skill set that modern people have completely lost. The fire burns lower, and you prepare for sleep knowing that medieval nights were times when the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds became thin. You'll sleep with one ear open, listening for sounds that don't belong, ready to wake your family if something threatens the fragile safety of your medieval home. Medieval nights taught people to appreciate dawn in ways that modern people, with their electric lights and 24-hour security, can barely comprehend. Sunrise wasn't just the beginning of a new day. It was proof that you'd survived another encounter with the dark. Marriage in medieval peasant life isn't the romantic fairy tale modern people imagine. It's more like a business merger between two families who are desperately hoping their children won't starve to death together. You're about to discover that medieval love stories were written by people who understood that survival trumped romance every single time. Until death do us part was less a romantic promise and more a realistic timeline estimate. Your one-room hut becomes a crowded nightmare when you add a spouse to the mix, because medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of separate bedrooms, walk-in closets, or even basic privacy. Everything happens in the same space, sleeping, eating, arguing, making up, and creating the next generation of medieval peasants who will inherit this charming lifestyle. Medieval homes were like studio apartments designed by people who thought personal space was a character flaw. The marriage arrangement began long before you ever laid eyes on your future spouse, orchestrated by parents who approached matchmaking with the strategic thinking of medieval generals planning a siege. Medieval marriages were economic alliances disguised as romantic ceremonies, where love was considered a nice bonus but financial stability was the main event. Your parents evaluated potential partners based on practical considerations like land ownership, livestock, and the ability to survive long enough to produce children. If you're a peasant woman, you typically married in your 20s rather than the teenage years common among nobility, mainly because it took time to accumulate enough resources for a dowry, and because peasant families needed your labor until they could afford to lose it. Your dowry might consist of household utensils, tools, furniture, clothing, and livestock. Basically everything you'd need to set up housekeeping in medieval style, assuming your definition of housekeeping includes sharing space with farm animals. The wedding ceremony itself takes place outside the church doors, because apparently medieval people thought the inside of churches was too fancy for peasant weddings. You stand on the left side while your groom stands on the right, facing the priest who asks if anyone knows any reason why this marriage shouldn't happen, which in medieval times could include anything from being too closely related to having made secret religious vows to someone having killed someone recently. The priest asks the crucial questions. Are you of legal age? 12 for girls, 14 for boys, because medieval people had very different ideas about childhood. Do you have parental consent, even though technically you don't need it? Are you related within the prohibited degrees, meaning you don't share a common great-great-grandparent, because medieval people took family trees seriously when it came to marriage. Your groom presents you with a wed, usually a ring but sometimes a brooch or other token, which serves as both engagement ring and wedding ring rolled into one medieval multitasking accessory. You wear this ring on your right hand rather than your left, because medieval people did everything differently just to confuse future historians. The ring exchange symbolizes consent, which was absolutely crucial because medieval marriage law required that both parties agree to the union, even if that agreement was heavily influenced by family pressure and economic necessity. The actual ceremony is remarkably brief, consisting mainly of vows that sound familiar to modern ears because we're still using the medieval script, promising to love, honor, and obey in sickness and in health, which in medieval times was basically promising to stick together through plague, famine, war, and whatever other disasters the universe decided to throw at you five. After the outdoor ceremony, everyone troops inside for a special mass, assuming the church is willing to let peasants inside for the occasion. The wedding feast that follows is the medieval equivalent of a potluck dinner, where everyone brings what they can afford and hopes there's enough food to go around. Medieval wedding receptions featured the innovative tradition of guests bringing small cakes that were stacked into a tower, and the bride and groom would try to kiss over this precarious cake mountain without knocking it down. The original wedding cake that doubled as an engineering challenge. Your new living arrangements require the organizational skills of a medieval logistics expert, because you're now sharing a space roughly the size of a modern bathroom with your spouse, any children who might arrive, and possibly elderly relatives who need care. Medieval peasant homes were multi-generational by necessity, creating family dynamics that would challenge modern therapists and make reality TV producers weep with joy. Privacy becomes a theoretical concept rather than a practical reality. Medieval peasants conducted their entire married lives in full view and hearing of their families, which meant that marital disputes, romantic moments, and everything in between became community entertainment. The phrase thin walls takes on new meaning when the walls are made of wattle and daub, and your neighbors are literally your roommates. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants actually developed genuine affection for their spouses, or simply learned to tolerate each other out of necessity. But the evidence suggests that many couples did find ways to create meaningful relationships within the constraints of their circumstances. Medieval marriage was less about finding your soulmate and more about finding someone you could work alongside to build a life that might last long enough to matter. The reality of medieval peasant marriage was that it represented hope in the face of overwhelming odds. Hope that the village healer approaches your mysterious rash with the confidence of someone who's seen every possible way the human body can malfunction and has developed creative solutions that range from surprisingly effective to probably illegal in most modern countries. Medieval medicine operated on principles that would make modern doctors question their career choices. But when you're facing illness in an age before antibiotics, you take whatever help you can get, even if that help involves leeches with attitude problems. Your symptoms: a spreading red rash that itches like medieval torture and burns like you've been rolling in nettles, could be anything from a simple skin condition to the early stages of something that will require last rites. Medieval people lived with the constant awareness that any change in their health could be the beginning of the end, and they approached illness with the fatalistic acceptance of people who understood that medical science was more art than science, and the art in question was abstract expressionism. The healer, Goodwife Edith, examines your condition with the intensity of someone reading ancient prophecies in a foreign language. Medieval healers were part doctor, part pharmacist, part priest, and part detective, trying to solve medical mysteries with a combination of inherited wisdom, personal experience, and educated guessing. She peers at your rash, prods it with a finger that's seen more diseases than a medieval plague pit, and pronounces her diagnosis with the authority of someone who's never heard of medical malpractice lawsuits. Imbalanced humors, she declares, which is medieval medical speak for something's wrong, but we're not entirely sure what. Medieval medicine was based on the theory that the human body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And illness occurred when these humors got out of balance, like a medieval chemistry set that someone had shaken too vigorously. The treatment, naturally, involves getting your humors back in line through methods that would make modern patients run screaming from the clinic. First comes the bloodletting, because medieval medical theory held that most problems could be solved by removing some of the patient's blood, which seems counterintuitive when dealing with someone who already looks like death warmed over. Goodwife Edith produces a collection of leeches that look like they've been dining well on previous patients, and you submit to the treatment with the resignation of someone who knows this might be your best chance at survival, even if the cure seems worse than the disease. The leeches attach themselves with the enthusiasm of medieval tax collectors, and you feel your life force being literally sucked away by creatures that look like they were designed by someone with a very dark sense of humor. Medieval leeches were the original medical professionals. They worked without anesthesia, never complained about working conditions, and always got paid in blood. The theory was that removing bad blood would allow your body to produce fresh, healthy blood, which makes about as much sense as most medieval medical theories. While the leeches do their work, Goodwife Edith prepares a poultice that contains ingredients ranging from the practical to the bizarre. Medieval pharmacology was like cooking with a recipe book written by someone who'd never actually tasted food. Lots of exotic ingredients mixed together, based on theoretical principles rather than practical experience. Your poultice contains willow bark, which actually does have anti-inflammatory properties, mixed with crushed pearls, which were expensive but medically useless, and something that might be powdered unicorn horn but is probably ground up narwhal tusk. The treatment continues with a tonic that tastes like someone mixed pond water with regret and added herbs for flavor. Medieval medicines were uniformly terrible tasting, partly because effective ingredients often taste bad and partly because medieval people believed that medicine should taste awful to be effective. The medical equivalent of no pain, no gain. You drink the concoction while trying not to think about what might be floating in it, because medieval quality control was about as reliable as medieval weather prediction. Goodwife Edith also prescribes dietary changes that involve avoiding certain foods that might aggravate your condition, which in medieval peasant terms means avoiding foods you couldn't afford anyway. Medieval medical diets were like modern elimination diets, except the elimination was usually done by poverty rather than medical necessity. You're told to avoid spicy foods, which is easy since medieval peasant cuisine was about as spicy as boiled cardboard, and rich foods, which is even easier since rich foods were a theoretical concept in peasant households. The healer also provides spiritual remedies, because medieval people understood that illness affected both body and soul. She gives you a protective charm made from herbs blessed by the local priest, along with specific prayers to recite while the treatment takes effect. Medieval medicine was holistic by necessity. Healers treated the whole person, not just the symptoms, mainly because they weren't entirely sure which parts of their treatment actually worked. Historians still argue whether medieval folk remedies were effective medicine or elaborate placebos, but modern research has shown that many traditional treatments actually had genuine medical benefits. Willow bark contains salicin, a compound similar to aspirin. Honey has antibacterial properties, and many herbs used by medieval healers are still used in modern medicine, though hopefully with better quality control and fewer leeches. The treatment regimen continues for several days, during which you follow Goodwife Edith's instructions with the dedication of someone who really doesn't want to die from a mysterious rash. Medieval patients were remarkably compliant, mainly because non-compliance often meant death, and medieval people were practical about their mortality. You drink the terrible tasting tonics, endure the leech treatments, and pray to whatever saints specialize in skin conditions. Your recovery, if it happens, will be attributed to the healer's skill, divine intervention, or your own strong constitution, depending on who's telling the story. Medieval medicine was like playing medical roulette. Sometimes the treatments worked, sometimes they didn't, and sometimes they made things worse. But it was better than doing nothing and hoping for spontaneous healing. The experience teaches you why medieval people developed such fatalistic attitudes toward health and illness. When the village court convenes under the great oak tree with all the pomp and circumstance of a medieval reality show, except the stakes are higher, and the judges have the legal training of people who learned law from other people, who learned law from someone who once met a lawyer. You've been dragged into a dispute over a pig, specifically, whether your pig damaged your neighbor's vegetable garden, and whether this constitutes a crime worthy of medieval justice or just another Tuesday in peasant life. Medieval justice operated on principles that would make modern legal scholars weep, but it was the best system available to people who understood that without some form of law enforcement, village life would devolve into a free-for-all where the person with the biggest stick made all the rules. The court consists of your fellow villagers, who will serve as both judge and jury in a legal system that valued community consensus over legal precedent and practical solutions over theoretical justice. The plaintiff, your neighbor Goodman Walter, presents his case with the dramatic flair of someone who's been practicing his courtroom speech since the pig incident occurred. Medieval legal proceedings were part theater, part negotiation, and part community entertainment, where everyone got to participate in the drama of determining guilt, innocence, and appropriate punishment. Walter describes the devastation to his cabbages with the passion of someone describing a military invasion, complete with gestures and sound effects. Your defense strategy involves a combination of character witnesses, circumstantial evidence, and the medieval legal principle of reasonable doubt, which in peasant courts meant, maybe it wasn't actually my pig. Medieval legal proceedings relied heavily on witness testimony, because physical evidence was often unavailable and forensic science consisted of looking at the damage and making educated guesses about what might have caused it. The court examines the evidence, which consists of pig tracks in Walter's garden, testimony from neighbors who may or may not have seen your pig in the vicinity, and a detailed analysis of the damage that would impress modern agricultural investigators. Medieval people were surprisingly thorough when it came to documenting property damage, mainly because property was scarce, and every destroyed cabbage represented a real loss to a family's food supply. The legal proceedings reveal the complex social dynamics of medieval village life, where everyone knows everyone else's business and past grievances influence present judgments. Medieval courts weren't just about determining facts. They were about maintaining community harmony and ensuring that disputes didn't escalate into feuds that could tear the village apart. The judges consider not just the immediate case, but the long-term implications of their decision on village relationships. Your case becomes complicated when it's revealed that Walter's fence was in disrepair, raising questions about contributory negligence that would challenge modern legal scholars. Medieval law recognized that property owners had responsibilities to protect their property, and a damaged fence might shift some of the blame from the pig owner to the garden owner. The court debates this point with the intensity of medieval philosophers discussing the nature of existence. The testimony phase reveals information that has nothing to do with the pig incident, but everything to do with village politics. Someone mentions that Walter was seen talking to the miller's wife, which has implications for his moral character. Someone else brings up the time you helped during the harvest, which speaks to your community standing. Medieval justice was holistic. It considered the whole person, not just the specific incident. The court also considers the economic impact of various potential punishments. Medieval justice was practical. There was no point in imposing fines that couldn't be paid or punishments that would harm the community's overall welfare. The goal was restitution rather than retribution, making the injured party whole rather than simply punishing the wrongdoer. Historians still argue whether medieval village courts were effective institutions of justice or elaborate systems for community gossip and social control. But they served important functions in maintaining order in communities that had limited access to higher legal authorities. Village courts handled everything from property disputes to moral offenses, creating a legal system that was responsive to local needs and community values. The deliberation process involves the entire community, because medieval people believed that justice should be transparent and that everyone should have a voice in decisions that affected community harmony. The judges retire to discuss the case, which means they stand under a different tree and argue about pig behavior, fence maintenance, and the proper relationship between neighbors in medieval society. The verdict, when it comes, reflects the medieval preference for practical solutions over abstract justice. You're found partially responsible for the pig incident, but not entirely to blame, given Walter's negligent fence maintenance. The punishment involves compensating Walter for his damaged vegetables, while he agrees to repair his fence to prevent future incidents. Medieval justice was about finding solutions that everyone could live with, literally. The fine imposed is calculated based on your ability to pay and the actual damage caused, because medieval courts understood that excessive punishments could destroy families and harm the community. You'll pay in produce rather than money, because medieval peasants operated in a barter economy where cash was scarce, but vegetables were currency. The court session concludes with a communal meal, because medieval people understood that legal proceedings could create hard feelings that needed to be addressed through shared food and drink. Medieval justice was social as well as legal. It aimed to restore community harmony as well as individual rights. The experience teaches you that medieval justice was rough, but not necessarily. The village festival arrives like a medieval Christmas morning, except instead of presents under a tree, you get watery ale, questionable food, and the kind of entertainment that makes you question whether medieval people actually knew how to have fun or just pretended really well. Today marks the feast of Saint Bartholomew, patron saint of tanners and people who have been flayed alive, which seems like an oddly specific combination, but perfectly captures the medieval approach to celebration. Equal parts joy and morbid fascination with suffering. The festival preparations began before dawn, with the entire village contributing whatever they could spare to create a communal feast that would either be remembered as the best meal of the year, or the event that finally killed everyone through collective food poisoning. Medieval festivals were community efforts that required the organizational skills of military campaigns and the optimism of people who believed that sharing limited resources somehow made them multiply. The centerpiece of the celebration is a pig that was donated by the Lord's household, which means it's probably the first fresh meat most villagers have seen since the last festival. Medieval peasants lived on a diet that was heavy on grains and vegetables, but light on protein. So festival meat was like winning the medieval lottery, assuming the lottery involved sharing one pig among 50 people and hoping everyone got at least a taste. The ale flows freely, which in medieval terms means there's enough weak beer to make everyone slightly tipsy, but not enough to make anyone forget their problems entirely. Medieval festivals were carefully calibrated to provide just enough alcohol to create festive spirits, without causing the kind of chaos that would require divine intervention or armed force to resolve. The ale tastes like liquid bread mixed with optimism, and it has roughly the same alcohol content as modern energy drinks, but it's wet and it's free, which makes it the beverage of choice for people who understand that beggars can't be choosers. The entertainment begins with musicians who play instruments that look like they were designed by people who had heard of music, but never actually listened to any. Medieval musical instruments were crafted by local artisans who worked with whatever materials were available, resulting in drums made from animal skins, flutes carved from wood, and stringed instruments that produced sounds ranging from surprisingly melodic to cats fighting in a bag. The music is lively enough to inspire dancing and loud enough to drown out the sounds of people arguing about who gets the last piece of pig. Dancing follows, with villagers performing traditional steps that have been passed down through generations of people who understood that coordinated movement was one of the few forms of entertainment that didn't cost money. Medieval dancing was community activity that required cooperation, timing, and the ability to move in patterns without stepping on your neighbor's feet, which was more challenging than it sounds when everyone was wearing wooden shoes and had consumed questionable amounts of weak ale. The festival games include competitions that test skills actually useful in medieval life. Unlike modern sports that require specialized equipment and years of training, there's stone throwing, which develops the arm strength needed for farming and fighting. Foot races, which build the endurance required for running away from various medieval dangers. And wrestling matches that settle long-standing disputes, while providing entertainment for spectators who appreciate the combination of athletic skill and personal drama. The storytelling begins as the sun sets, with village elders sharing tales that blend history, mythology, and creative embellishment in ways that would make modern historians weep but medieval audiences cheer. Medieval storytelling was interactive entertainment, where the audience participated through reactions, questions, and occasional corrections when storytellers got too creative with well-known tales. The stories serve multiple purposes. They preserve community history, teach moral lessons, and provide entertainment that doesn't require literacy or expensive props. Food becomes the focus as the evening progresses, with dishes that represent the pinnacle of medieval peasant cuisine, which is to say they're edible, and there's enough to go around if everyone takes small portions. The feast includes bread that's actually white instead of the usual brown, vegetables that have been seasoned with herbs instead of just boiled into submission, and the aforementioned pig, which has been roasted to perfection by people who understand that this might be their only chance to eat meat until the next festival. Historians still argue whether medieval festivals were genuine expressions of joy or elaborate coping mechanisms for dealing with lives that were otherwise unrelentingly difficult. But either way, they served important social functions. Festivals provided opportunities for community bonding, stress relief, and the kind of shared experiences that created social cohesion in communities where cooperation was essential for survival. The celebration continues late into the night, with activities that range from innocent games to the kind of behavior that would require confession the next morning. Medieval festivals were times when normal social rules were relaxed, allowing people to express themselves in ways that weren't acceptable during ordinary times. The church tolerated this temporary loosening of moral standards because they understood that people needed outlets for emotions and desires that couldn't be suppressed indefinitely. As the festival winds down, you realize that medieval celebrations were exercises in making the most of very little, transforming ordinary ingredients into special meals, turning simple activities into memorable entertainment, and creating moments of joy in lives that offered few opportunities for happiness. Medieval people were experts at finding reasons to celebrate, even when there wasn't much to celebrate about. The morning after brings the inevitable reckoning, headaches from the ale, stomachaches from the rich food, and the return to ordinary life that makes the festival seem like a dream. But the memories will sustain the community through the long months until the next celebration, providing something to look forward to in lives that offered few guarantees beyond hard work and uncertain outcomes. The day ends as it began, with you collapsing onto your straw mattress like a medieval crash test dummy, every muscle in your body filing formal complaints about the working conditions they've endured. Your bones ache with the kind of deep, persistent pain that comes from a lifetime of manual labor, and you're pretty sure your spine has developed a permanent curve that matches the shape of the farming tools you've been wielding since before dawn. Medieval peasants didn't retire. They just worked until they couldn't work anymore, and then they worked a little more. You lie in the darkness listening to the sounds of your family settling in for another night of medieval survival, wondering if tomorrow will bring the same endless cycle of labor, worry, and small victories that define peasant existence. The baby cries with the persistence of someone who hasn't yet learned that medieval life doesn't respond well to complaints, while your spouse shifts restlessly on the straw, probably dreaming of the kind of sleep that comes without the constant awareness that survival depends on tomorrow's weather, the Lord's mood, and whether the crops decide to grow or give up entirely. The single room that serves as your entire world settles into the familiar sounds of a medieval night. The crackling of dying embers in the hearth, the scurrying of small creatures who have decided your home is their home too, and the distant sounds of the village preparing for another night of hoping that dawn will arrive without bringing disasters, diseases, or decisions that could change everything. Medieval nights were times for reflection, prayer, and the kind of exhausted gratitude that comes from surviving another day in a world designed to test human endurance. Your thoughts drift to the endless cycle that defines medieval peasant life. The same tasks repeated day after day, season after season, year after year, with variations that depend more on weather and luck than on personal choice or ambition. Medieval peasants lived in a world where change was usually bad news, where stability meant survival, and where the greatest achievement was making it through another year without losing family members to disease, famine, or the various other ways that medieval life could end abruptly and without warning. The irony of your existence isn't lost on you. You spend your days producing food for people who have enough to eat, while your own family counts every grain like precious gems. You build and maintain the infrastructure that supports a society where your position at the bottom is considered natural and ordained by God Himself. Medieval peasants were the foundation of feudal society, but foundations are meant to be invisible, supporting everything above them while receiving little recognition for their essential role. Yet there's a strange satisfaction in the work itself, in the knowledge that your labor creates something tangible and necessary. Medieval peasants understood the direct connection between effort and survival in ways that modern people, insulated by complex economic systems and technological buffers, rarely experience. Your bread comes from grain you grew. Your shelter exists because you built and maintained it. And your family survives because of skills and knowledge you've developed through years of practical experience. The community that surrounds you, for all its gossip, petty disputes, and social tensions, represents a form of social insurance that modern people might envy. Medieval villages were networks of mutual dependence where everyone knew everyone else's business, but they also knew everyone else's needs. When disaster struck, and in medieval times, disaster struck regularly, the community response was immediate and practical, based on the understanding that individual survival depended on collective survival. Your children sleep nearby, and you wonder what kind of life awaits them in a world where opportunities are limited by birth, gender, and social class, but where the fundamental human experiences of love, family, and community remain constant across centuries and social systems. Medieval peasant children learned early that life was hard, but they also learned resilience, practical skills, and the kind of adaptability that comes from growing up in a world where flexibility was essential for survival. The medieval world you inhabit is simultaneously smaller and larger than the modern world. Smaller in terms of geographical knowledge and technological possibilities, but larger in terms of the supernatural, the mysterious, and the unknown. Medieval people lived with a sense of wonder and terror that modern people, with their scientific explanations and technological solutions, have largely lost. Every sunset might bring supernatural visitors, every illness might be divine punishment, and every unusual event might be a sign of cosmic significance. As sleep approaches, you reflect on the strange dignity of medieval peasant life. The way that people facing overwhelming challenges developed systems of meaning, community, and survival that sustained them through difficulties that would challenge modern people with all their advantages. Medieval peasants were experts at making something from nothing, finding joy in small pleasures, and maintaining hope in circumstances that offered few reasons for optimism. The rhythm of medieval life, for all its hardships, had a coherence and purpose that modern life sometimes lacks. Medieval peasants knew their place in the cosmic order, understood their role in the community, and found meaning in work that directly supported human survival and flourishing. The simplicity was brutal, but it was also clarifying. Medieval people knew what mattered because everything else had been stripped away by necessity. Your last conscious thought before sleep claims you as a recognition that medieval peasant life, despite its hardships, represented a form of human existence that was authentic, connected, and meaningful in ways that transcend historical periods and social systems. Medieval peasants lived fully human lives within the constraints of their time and circumstances, creating families, communities, and cultures that sustained them through challenges that would test anyone's resolve. Tomorrow will bring another day of the same struggles, the same small victories, and the same quiet heroism that defines ordinary people living extraordinary lives in difficult times. Medieval peasants were the unsung heroes of human history, the people who kept civilization running while others made the decisions and took the credit. The darkness settles over your medieval world like a familiar blanket, bringing rest to bodies worn by honest labor and minds tired from the constant vigilance required for survival. In a few hours, the rooster will crow, the sun will rise, and the cycle will begin again. Another day of medieval life, another opportunity to prove that human beings can adapt, survive, and even thrive in circumstances that test every aspect of human resilience and ingenuity. Sleep comes finally, bringing dreams of better harvests, healthier children, and the kind of peace that comes from knowing you've done everything possible to ensure that tomorrow will arrive safely for the people you love. Medieval peasants slept the sleep of people who had earned their rest through honest work and genuine effort, and who would wake ready to face whatever challenges the new day might bring. Sweet dreams, medieval peasant. You've survived another day in one of history's most challenging times, and that achievement deserves recognition, respect, and the kind of peaceful rest that comes from a life lived with courage, determination, and the quiet heroism of ordinary people doing